Fantasy has offered us many races that perplex the mind, and some of these races are strange and otherworldly, their origins a complete mystery. But some races are not that strange, and sometimes they're death, and today we're discussing one such race. The Dwarves are a race of small folk who usually are not much taller than an average man's waist or belly, described as having thick, long beards, even the female dwarves, capable of growing facial hair. They are also described as hardy, stubborn, and stiff-necked people. Today, we're going to discuss what dwarves would have been like in history if they'd actually existed, and what impact they would make on the world. Would they still be around today? What would be their methods of war? And would they coexist with humanity well? This is Fantastical History. To start with, let's go ahead and get a few things straight about dwarves and their origins. We're not here to talk about real dwarfism, which is an actual medical condition that plagues certain folks. We're talking about fantasy dwarves, very much popularized by Tolkien in his Lord of the Rings series. The dwarves he created have been the standard for most dwarfish interpretations since. All dwarves are described as being short, stout, and hardy. They all tend to possess thick facial hair, including the women, and they are said to be expert craftsmen, miners, and blacksmiths. Tolkien has commented that he was inspired by Jewish culture when creating the dwarves, and it makes sense. Dwarves are a very stiff-necked and stubborn people who hold their heritage, traditions, and values in incredibly high regard, not unlike the Israelites in the Bible. Some of their customs are also similar, such as dwarves ripping out their own beards when sad is similar to ancient Israelites or Hebrews ripping their own clothes and shaving their heads to show mourning. Also, much like the biblical Israelites, the dwarves are incredibly stubborn and stiff-necked, believing other races an outsider assistance, at least unneeded if not insulting. They're not likely to change their minds or decisions once set on a course, and this can often lead them to disaster.
You dwarves have as much imagination as the rocks you work, always convinced you're the ones who are right.
They're also slow to forget grudges and will hold on to past actions, both good and bad, for long periods of time. In fact, in Warhammer, dwarves keep a record of every person, race, or group who has ever wronged them, and will hold these grudges for all eternity, recording them in something called the Book of Grudges.
Every wrong is recorded. Every slight against us. Page after page, etched in blood. Clan Gunnison, Carrick Peaks, Joseph Bookman. One wrong put right. But the great Book of Grudges remains full.
It can be very easy to offend and upset a dwarf, but also difficult to regain their trust. And perhaps this is the reason dwarves tend to make their homes in high mountains. Depicted as expert tunnelers, miners, and craftsmen, dwarves have a fascination and appreciation for valuable metals, gems, and currency, making them out to be greedy or miserly in some cases. In The Hobbit, the dwarves were so engulfed in their own greed and self-worth, it brought a dragon to their doorstep, and it led them to nearly being destroyed in a war for reclaiming that said gold.
Is this treasure truly worth more than your honor? Our honor? Thorin, I was also there. I gave my word.
For that I am grateful. It was nobly done, but the treasure in this mountain does not belong to the people of Lake Town. This gold is ours. And ours alone. By my life, I will not part.
So we now, I would say, have a pretty accurate or at least somewhat clear understanding of the way dwarves are. So now let's talk about how they would have looked in history. Well, we talked about how elves would be worshipped for their beauty, but dwarves likely would not be. Much like the Israelites, they might be mistreated or disliked by many cultures. For one thing, their natural ability to mine and find precious metals, as well as their fierce protection of them, would make many distrust them and believe that they're shady or greedy. However, one thing is absolutely certain. They would become invaluable. Since dwarves are such masters of mining and forging, humanity would likely look to them for trade and for receiving their ore, mineral, and gem needs. It would be very easy for dwarvish kings to hold a mountain or mining hall and work out trade with local human settlements. After all, the weakness of living in a mountain is a lack of sunlight. No sunlight means no crops means no livestock, and none of the above means very little food. Mankind and the dwarves would probably work out a mutually beneficial arrangement, I believe. While mankind needs dwarves for metals, gems, and minerals, the dwarves need man for the crops, food, and alcohol they can provide. Now, of course, there would obviously be dissension, there would likely be minor wars and scuffles between the two races, but as long as the dwarves and the humans in general control their own resources and have a mastery over them, the relationship would remain generally mutual and strong. They would be one of the few races that we talk about in the series that have a very healthy and profitable relationship with humanity. But war is ever present, so how would dwarves deal with warfare in the march of time? Now, first of all, let's talk about how I believe dwarves would actually fight. What would they do? Well, the first thing that I think about is I think back to what Shad said, said that dwarves would use bows and arrows. And I think that there's probably some truth in that. They probably do have a body made for that. But I think about large dwarfish warfare, and I think there's probably a better way. I think dwarves would probably get inspired by Roman tactics. The whole idea of building a shield wall. When you have a size disadvantage, the best thing you want to do is hunker down with a group, get behind a shield wall, and brace for impact. When dwarves were designed, Tolkien said that he took inspiration from Jewish and Nordic culture, but I don't see Jewish or Nordic culture being the inspiration for their fighting style. We see a little bit of this in the Hobbit movie, where we see how the dwarves fight in the Battle of the Five Armies, and I think that this formation kind of setup would be very good for dwarves to do, especially if they decide to fight in their mountains, which we'll get to in a minute. But for now, know that that's the way I see dwarves fighting. Now, believe it or not, I think we can again consider the fact that dwarves, while not feeling superior to mankind, would at least feel estranged from them. They'd try to keep to themselves. Man's battles are for man to contend with. They're not going to jump in to help out one kingdom over another necessarily in a battle between two human cultures. Now, if these men came to them to buy goods, weapons, iron, that's negotiable. We can talk about that, but we're not committing troops. We're not going to send our soldiers. For one thing, why would we want to waste troops or lives and potential trade partners on battles and wars that we have no stake in? Coin is coin, whether it's from the Spartans or the Athenians. Coin is coin, whether it comes from the Romans or the Carthaginians. Coin is coin, whether it's coming from the colonists or the loyalists. But if push came to shove, how would they fight? Well, we talked about the whole idea of them copying from Roman fighting style. And we talked about what Shad said about them being decent at bows and arrows. But let's talk about the psychology of their warfare, not just the physicality. The dwarves would likely keep to their own mountains. Again, they're going to seclude themselves. They either feel superior or estranged from humanity, so they're not going to really go out of their way to engage in humans on their own turf. They're going to say, look, if you want to fight us, come to us, okay? Which is actually a good idea because it gives them home field advantage. Dwarves keep to themselves in their caves and their mountains away from the world. They likely wouldn't draw up battle lines outside an open fields or plains where their size disadvantage could be used against them, but instead they'd probably restrict their fights to within the mountains or holds they call home. Should an invading army try to invade the hold, they are now at the mercy of dwarves who will know the caverns inside and out. Ambush attacks, swift punishing hit and run tactics will be used. Sabotages, traps, and other such maneuvers would be popular. Their smaller bodies will let them move around in tunnels much more quickly and effectively than normal human men. Plus, if they use that strategy of building up phalanx walls or shield walls to block off enemy approaches, they can totally seal off a cavern and just waste anyone inside of it. This is probably the way they prefer to fight anyway, in their own turf. If they leave their turf, it's unfamiliar territory, they're playing into human hands, and a lot of their advantages disappear, both in size and in strength. So I think that would be their first psychology of war. Make the humans fight on their turf. If they're forced to leave their mountain, then they're going to bring as much siege weaponry as they can. They're going to bring heavy artillery. They're going to bring as much armor and metal as they can to protect themselves. And they probably won't ever break a box-like formation where they can stay hunkered down behind shields, because they know that if they scatter, if they get separated, it'll be very easy for human archers or human cavalrymen to cut them off. Plus, let's talk about that too. Dwarves probably wouldn't have a cavalry. For one thing, again, we talked about how they couldn't raise livestock. That includes horses. They probably wouldn't have much of a cavalry. We see in The Hobbit that they ride pigs or rams or something. Maybe rams I could see if they're living in mountains. They might have a stock of rams that they might be able to domesticate and ride. But as a general rule, again, like I said, they're going to want to stick to their mountains and in their caverns. They're not really going to have a set up cavalry that they're going to be able to contend with. So another reason they don't want to get out of their mountain to fight, right? The best counter to their tactic would be if humans who were invading surrounded the mountains or cavern and starved out the warriors inside. Eventually, they surrender out of desperation, right? Because they can't get out of their mountain to get provisions to live off of. But this strategy has two problems. Firstly, it labors under the assumption that the assaulting army doesn't need the dwarves for goods. Remember, the relationship between the two races is beneficial for both parties. Sure, the dwarves aren't getting their food, but at the same time, you humans aren't getting the supplies and goods you need. Eventually, you're going to start hurting yourself. Now, if the attacking army isn't who the dwarves are trading with at the time, don't you think their trading partners are going to come at some point and bail them out? Let's say that the dwarfish city is doing trade with human settlement A. Human settlement B is jealous of this, so they tell the dwarves to start trading with them. The dwarves say, no, we like our current situation, so human settlement B surrounds the mountain and threatens the dwarves. You're going to start trading with us or we're going to starve you out. Don't you think settlement A, who the dwarves are currently trading with, are going to say, hey, we better back up our trading partners. And now you're dealing with a war on two fronts, which you don't want to deal with. Again, the dwarves have ways here. Much like the Hebrews in history, they find ways to survive. And secondly, dwarves have access to minerals and heavy machinery necessary for mining. Breaking and digging rocks. Odds are good that they have some degree of early explosives or heavy weaponry purposely designed to destroy or break in precise manners. What's to say they can't repurpose some of these into anti-siege weaponry? And this brings up the point that I really want to hit on. The idea that dwarves, should they exist, would actually change the face of our world as we know it. We haven't talked much about this. When we talked about goblins and elves, we talked about how the world we know would look a little different because they're here. But dwarves being able to contribute something. Think about that. They're the first one we've talked about that actually contributes something new. Dragons don't contribute something. Goblins don't contribute something. Elves, not that we know of, would contribute anything different. Dwarves are expert miners and craftsmen. They're expert blacksmiths, according to legend. Humans in the real world, it developed new methods and machines and directives for mining, for crafting, for smithing. We developed new ways of doing these things. But if dwarves have curved the market on that for centuries, if we've spent centuries relying on dwarves to do that for us and we just traded with them, humans might not see a need to invent any of this stuff in the world anymore. Some of the things that we invent may never come to fruition. The dwarves have provided for us for so long that we just work with them now. Eventually, humanity might literally become dependent on dwarvish mining and ore production. It stands to reason that through their work, dwarves might become very profitable and very wealthy from their trade. In the meantime, technology and metallurgy would accelerate in not only value, but also in style. We'd progress rapidly technologically, and it's reasonable to assume the dwarves are shrewd enough to develop tools and equipment for digging and mining. Humans would have to quickly establish tools and gear to keep up. Crop and livestock production is going to become essential. We're going to have to really push the idea of livestock and crop creation. The industrial age would look a lot different. It might even come sooner. We'd see firearms probably a little sooner, since dwarves are going to be developing high explosives to mine and dig. And downside to that is we might see longer lasting slave labor. The reason why being, if humanity has to really push to keep agriculture and crops coming to satisfy dwarfish needs for trade, we might need more people at the beck and call, which means slavery might last longer. But the counter to that is, because we need production stepped up fast, technology that would help us with production would also come quicker, like the cotton gin and textile mills and stuff like that. We'd see these things come a lot quicker. Frankly, it would be astounding to see what today's world would look like if dwarves were real. I dare say they'd flourish in our world. A race of beings that though they're small, hairy, and stout in nature, with a stubbornness as fierce as the rocks they break, they would possibly control at least half of the wealth of this world, built on nothing but the sweat of their backs and the thickness of their heads, as they use their minds and metal to help build the world we live in, from the very foundation upwards. Dwarves are described as being very stubborn and sometimes hot-headed and even goofy in some of the Lord of the Rings movies. Just look at Gimli. But I think that dwarves possess a hardiness and wisdom we might overlook in some of our more popular medium. They are a race that I think gets often overlooked because they just don't appeal as much. When you look at an elf, you think, wow, physical attractiveness, beautiful, amazing. They are clearly higher up, and that's why there's kind of a fascination and even, dare I say, fetish for elfish culture and elfish people. Very few people pick the dwarves when they're deciding their race, am I right? Very few people see dwarves as a very unique or cool race to play, but I think, if you really think about the way we could see dwarves in real life, they might be the race that lasts the longest and would be profiting while doing it. Thank you guys for following me on this episode of Fantastical History as we looked at dwarves. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Drop a comment to talk about what you thought and to share any other ideas for what to do next in the Fantastical History. Like if you enjoyed, tell your friends about it, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you for coming.